He's one of the most divisive figures in American politics today. To some, he's Washington's most famous warmonger. To others, a fearless defender of US interests. John Bolton's decades of conservative foreign policy have influenced the position and actions of the United States in conflicts worldwide, from Iraq to Iran, Syria and North Korea, to mention just a few. Ever since first serving under President Ronald Reagan's administration back in the 1980s, Bolton built a career as a solid conservative Republican politician. He was Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization when President George H.W. Bush was in the White House. And when his son was, Bolton was Under Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, as well as Ambassador to the UN for President George W. Bush. And most recently, National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump. But their working relationship ended in acrimony and accusations after 17 months. Trump tweeted Bolton's services were no longer needed in the White House. Bolton insists he quit. His recent book, The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir, caused controversy as Bolton portrays a president driven only by his desire for re-election. In this interview, we go beyond this latest well-covered controversy to explore what was the truth of his policy advice and positions and whether he has any regrets. Did he really encourage the Trump administration to take on the whole world at the same time, as President Trump stated, or is he just misunderstood? We find out as John Bolton talks to Al Jazeera. Mr. Bolton, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be with you.
So, some call you a hawk, some see you as a patriot, some say even you're a warmonger. What term would you use to describe yourself?
Well, I don't much like bumper sticker terms to begin with. I've always tried to formulate...
Oh, come on, it's the American way, isn't it?
Not in policy circles. I've always tried to formulate policy with a regard to safeguarding American interests around the world, and that's what I've done for a long time.
All right. Now, would you concede that you made some serious errors of judgment while safeguarding American interests around the world, while advocating for some of the wars in the past you're associated with, though?
Well, you'd have to be more specific. I'm sure I've made my share of mistakes over the course of my professional career.
Well, let me be more specific then. I mean, in an interview, November the 20th, 2002, you said, quote, "We are confident Saddam Hussein has hidden weapons of mass destruction and production facilities in Iraq." That was wrong. Do you concede that was a massive error in judgment?
Well, that was a recitation of what we thought our intelligence showed. In substantial part, it was due to the declarations that Saddam Hussein himself made in the field of chemical and biological weapons in particular.
So I'm not asking you to go back and explain why you said what you said. I think we're all very familiar with the history of the Iraq War, but my simple question is, it was a massive error of judgment, was it not?
No, it wasn't. If you want to listen instead of talking, I'll try and explain it to you.
Okay.
Saddam Hussein himself made declarations about his capabilities in the area of chemical and biological weapons. He stated in disclosures to the United Nations weapons inspectors that he had large stockpiles of chemical weapons, manufacturing facilities, and the like. The mistake that the U.S. and everybody else made was in believing what Saddam himself said. If you look at the analysis after the war of the Rob Silberman Commission, they pointed out that at the time of the actual invasion of Iraq in 2003, there was really no dissent from the proposition that Saddam had these chemical and biological weapons capabilities. In fact, I remember Hans Blix, who was the head of the commission, former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, saying to Saddam, well, look, you declared these weapons in the early 1990s, and now you say that you've destroyed them all. Where's your verification records? He said, this isn't jam.
Well, I think, Mr. Bolton, many would have a different, perhaps, recollection of what happened and how the world viewed some of the claims that US officials were making to the UN Security Council, that many were unconvinced that
enough evidence was there to suggest Iraq had.
Well,
But
well,
I
look,
really don't want to go back into to revisit the history.
We're going to get to the bottom of this
But
historical
my point
reality.
is, whatever
when you edit this
the
program,
point,
I'm sure
whatever
that you
the
will
reason
go back
was,
and find everybody who disagreed with Saddam Hussein's own assertions about his chemical weapons capability. At the time of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I don't think you'll find any serious scholar knowledgeable in the area who wouldn't say that Saddam's claims were correct.
there were a lot of, in fact, countries that felt Iraq did not have enough weapons of mass destruction evidence. That's why they didn't back the invasion. But again, my point is not so much whether, I mean, it's fine if you want to tell viewers that, well, Saddam said it and your job was simply to believe it. But my point is...
Well, that's not what I said, of course.
All right. Well, let me put the question this way. Do you have any regrets about your role in an invasion which one of the principal bodies of international law, as you know, the UN Security Council, did not back, didn't authorize, it didn't find weapons of mass destruction? And as you know, sadly, it killed a lot of Americans and a lot of Iraqis. North of 1 million human beings died in that. Do you have any regrets about that?
Well, I think your figures are grossly inaccurate. The fact that the Security Council didn't authorize it is irrelevant. The United States, like every other member of the UN,
maybe to you,
has
so. A lot of countries it was relevant.
Right, an inherent right of individual and collective self-defense, which we exercise. Saddam Hussein was a threat to international peace and security. There's no doubt about it. And one can argue this out for as long as you want, and I'm happy to do it for the entire half hour we have, because I think it's very important that people understand. You brought it up. I didn't bring it up. It's very important that people understand.
Do you have any regrets?
That the world, I'm explaining my answer to you, thank you, that the world is a better place with Saddam not only out of power, but executed after a trial by his fellow Iraqis. That didn't solve all the problems in the region, that's for sure. Others have cropped up from Iran and elsewhere. But the fact is that there was not going to be international peace and security in the Middle East until the belligerent Saddam Hussein regime left the scene.
All right, so no regrets?
The only regret I have is that in 2011, Barack Obama imprudently withdrew all American forces from Iraq. I think that's
the only regret you have of the whole war.
Well, let me finish my explanation here. That led to the subsequent destabilization of the regime, and in part contributed to the rise of ISIS. It was, after all, the Iraqi regime that invaded Kuwait in 1990 and set off this entire chain of events. That was an act of unprovoked aggression by Saddam Hussein. Even though he was expelled from Kuwait with massive military losses in 1991, he had not learned his lesson, sadly, and he was supporting terrorist actions around the region and globally.
All right, we'll leave viewers to draw their conclusions on that. In 2015, in an op-ed for the New York Times, you wrote, "To stop Iran's bomb Iran." Do you still believe in bombing Iran today?
You know, I didn't write that headline. I know some people don't appreciate this, but authors don't get to write the headlines for their op-ed pieces. I wouldn't have written the headline that way, and I haven't written an op-ed for the New York Times since then, since I think they distorted what I said. My point, they did not quote me, sir. The point I was
just to be clear,
make,
so you'd never called for the bombing of Iran? Is that your position?
No. You quoted the headline, and I'm explaining to you that the headline was written by the New York Times, not by me. Now,
have you ever called for the bombing of Iran?
For a second, I'm sure if you'll stop for a second, I'll get to explain what I did say in numerous op-eds and speeches, television and radio appearances. And that is that at that time and subsequently, the Ayatollah's regime was doing everything they could to advance a nuclear weapons program and a ballistic missile program that threatened their neighbors in the region, in Europe, and ultimately the United States. And I believe that because of the threat posed by nuclear weapons in the hands of a rogue state like Iran, that we needed to have a much tougher policy.
Does that tougher policy include bombing Iran?
I'm sure you're going to let me finish now. I just know you are. That if we came to a day...
Well, so you're not really answering the question with all due respect.
thank you, that the use of force could not be ruled out, and that the Ayatollahs needed to understand that.
Please answer the question, sir. Do you advocate the bombing of Iran today?
No, I don't advocate the bombing of Iran today, and the reason for that, and I'm sure you'll let me give a reason, won't you?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much. The reason is that somebody, and I don't know who it is, has caused a number of detonations at the Natanz nuclear facility, at the Parchin facility, and at other facilities that the government of Iran itself has said have caused substantial damage to its nuclear program. Now, I don't know who it is, but I think they're doing a service to mankind and peace and security in the region. The regime of the Ayatollahs is a threat. It's a threat to its neighbors, and it's a threat globally.
Do you think Iran should have been bombed back in 2015 when you were giving those TV interviews you mentioned?
No, and because that's not what I said at the time. The fact is, over a long period of time, Iran has lied to the International Atomic Energy Agency, lied to the international community, lied about its nuclear and ballistic missile activities, and by this pattern of deceit, made substantial progress toward its obvious strategic objective of getting deliverable nuclear weapons. I think that's unacceptable. And I think that as a matter of basic self-defense, people who fear what could happen when a regime that extreme gets the world's most destructive weapon, that we're entitled to take steps to protect ourselves and to prevent it from happening.
So why do you think so? So many people have misunderstood you then. If I've understood you correctly, you're saying you don't advocate bombing Iran and you didn't advocate bombing Iran in 2015. Among those people who seems then to have misunderstood you is the US President himself, who in a June 21st, 2019 interview, when asked if his advisors were pushing him into military action against Iran, answered, quote, "If it was up to him, Bolton would take on the whole world at the same time." Why do you think you're so misunderstood?
Well, I think the president has his own problems with cognitive ability. That was one example of it. And, I can't judge why other people don't read and take seriously what I say or listen to what I have to say. I'd be happy for you to take any quotation that you can find from something I've written or something I've said, and I'd be happy to discuss it with you.
Thank you very much. Well, we've got lots of quotes, so thank you for agreeing to look at them for us.
Let's go.
All right, now 2 years after the US withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and embarked on the policy of maximum pressure on Iran, Iran has now resumed uranium enrichment, as I'm sure you know. It's restarted centrifuge research and development and expanded its stockpile of nuclear fuel. As we sit here today, do you think sanctions have worked?
I think they've had a crushing effect on the Iranian regime, and in terms of what they were doing
No, sir,
or
but I'm
not
asking,
doing.
are they working on curbing the Iranian nuclear?
One moment, I'm sure you're going to let me finish this answer.
Well,
maybe I'll just continue and hope that
well,
people
no,
will be able to hear me.
If you will answer the question, though. I'm not asking about its impact on the regime.
I am answering the question. When you interrupt in the middle of a sentence, I think that's hardly fair. Do you think that's fair?
I think it's fair if you're drifting off, sir. Would you address whether you think it's working on?
You make that decision unilaterally, I suppose.
Well, you're a big believer in unilateral action, I understand. But if we can come back to the question,
why don't you just ask the question and give the answer too? That would be fine.
I think the viewers would much hear you answer it, but answer the question, sir.
And why?
So, well, please answer the question. Do you think it's impacted and reined in Iran's nuclear program, not its impact on the regime or its stability or popularity or economy?
I don't believe the regime was honoring the nuclear agreement to begin with. There are a number of violations that I think have been laid out on the record of the IAEA in Vienna. And we know in particular that the regime blocked IAEA access to a number of sites that they felt they should have access to. And we know from the Israeli raid, which uncovered extraordinary records about Iran's nuclear weapons activity, that the entire agreement was based on lies by the regime that it had never had a nuclear weapons program and that it would continue in that vein. So, I think it's a mistake to say we know with certainty what exactly Iran was doing during the time that the nuclear weapons deal was in effect, because I think much of what they were doing we didn't have visibility into, including possible cooperation with North Korea, which of course also has an illegitimate nuclear weapons program. When the United States withdrew from the deal in May of 2018, many people said U.S. sanctions will not be effective. It won't have it won't put pressure on Iran. In fact, I think the popular support for the regime in Tehran is at the lowest level it's been since the revolution of 1979, and I think the ongoing destruction of its program that we're seeing now shows that their efforts to continue to advance towards nuclear weapons have never been given up. Iran has never made a strategic decision to give up its nuclear weapons program.
So with all due respect, I let you go, didn't interrupt you this time, but you didn't answer the simple question I asked you, which was how did it curb Iran's nuclear program? You've talked about everything else possibly. Well, we'll leave that. We have other questions to cover. I think we'll leave it for the audience. And let me ask you about the war in Syria. Do you think it was a mistake to perhaps supply back a group like the YPG, the Syrian Kurdish group, which has substantial ties, according to the testimony of the US Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter? He confirmed to the Senate Armed Services Committee that the YPG has substantial ties to another Kurdish group, I'm sure you're familiar with, the PKK, which, as he admitted, the US considers a terrorist group. Should the US be arming one group linked to terrorists who bomb shopping malls in Turkey to try and constrain ISIS?
Well, if I had been involved at the beginning in developing the strategy to go after ISIS, I would not have chosen the approach that the Obama administration did choose. But when the Trump administration came into office, it inherited that strategy. When I joined the White House, I inherited that strategy as well. And I think it was the strongly held view and the correct view of many people that the Kurds had lived up to their side of the bargain in Syria, that they were directing their activities against ISIS, that this was not a situation where they were aiding the PKK in Turkey. That was the understanding that was reached with them initially, and it's an understanding that we felt strongly about. But we also felt strongly that we should not abandon those Kurdish forces, Syrian Kurds, who had helped us to go after the ISIS territorial caliphate.
So would you allow me to interrupt? Because you already haven't answered the question. I mean, do you think it was appropriate? Should I understand if your answer is yes, it's still appropriate?
I just answered, really, honestly, sir. You can keep saying that, and your viewers will make up their minds. I've given you the answer. If you want to ask the question again, I'd be happy to repeat the answer.
Did you ever object to that policy when you came in? You said the administration you worked in inherited that from the Obama administration. Just curious, did you ever object to that?
The main objective of the policy was the destruction of the ISIS territorial caliphate and the neutralization of ISIS strength in eastern Syria and western Iraq. I think that objective was desirable. The vehicle that we were using, one of the vehicles we were using, was the YPG. As I said before, as I was answering your question a moment ago, they had directed their activities against ISIS, which is what they were originally asked to do, and were not providing the assistance we had given them to the PKK in Turkey.
How do you see the Gulf crisis and the split that's caused within the region? Has that opened the door for more Iranian influence?
Look, I think that if I could wave a magic wand over the GCC members, I would see the differences among them resolved. I think that these differences are real. It's not something that some outsider is going to fix for them. I think that if there were closer cooperation, if there were a stronger front against the main threat to peace and security in the region, which is the Ayatollahs in Tehran, that everyone would be better off. But this is something I don't believe that the United States can influence. I think the the Gulf Arab states will come to their own resolution in their own good time. I hope it's sooner rather than later.
All right, I have a quote for you. I hope you weren't misquoted on this occasion. February 28th, 2018, you wrote an opinion piece for the Wall Street Journal in which you advocated a first strike on North Korea, saying it's perfectly legitimate for the US to respond to the current necessity posed by North Korea's nuclear weapons by striking first. So do you still believe the US should strike first against North Korea, assuming that you weren't misquoted there?
Look, I wasn't misquoted. I wrote the article, and it was basically a justification for preemptive action if we decided to take it. Many people argued there was no basis for it, and this was the explanation why there was. My own preferred outcome in respect of the North Korean nuclear weapons program is the elimination of North Korea by reunifying the Korean Peninsula essentially under the government of South Korea. I think that's the surest way to avoid the threat of North Korea and also to do best by the Korean people.
So did you advocate ever to the Trump administration first strike on North Korea, or ever in your very long, illustrious career, a military attack on North Korea?
Look, I make the same point about North Korea that I have about Iran. When you see a rogue regime like that threatening the United States and its neighbors, we have to consider what's necessary to protect innocent civilians. And I write in the book, I quote former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joseph Dunford, who said what's unthinkable to him is to leave residents of the United States at risk of an attack from North Korea. I think if we acted more decisively earlier, we wouldn't be at the state we are now, where both North Korea and Iran over these past years have grown much more dangerously close to having a deliverable nuclear weapons capability. It's not just a threat to the United States, it's a threat to many others, which is why the priority of preventing nuclear proliferation has always been very high on my agenda.
Right. Once again, sir, you're using very vague and general terms that you've advocated more decisive action. Let me repeat to you the question, which I feel hasn't been really answered. Have you advocated a military strike?
Economic pressure would be an example of that.
I'm not sure I caught that. Did you ever advocate a military strike on North Korea?
I said no before, and I think the transcript or review of this tape will demonstrate that. What I was saying was, looking at the broad range of policy options, you can't rule it out. If you're going to protect innocent civilians, you can't rule it out.
Do you believe in international law, sir, which upholds the very American and international values of equal rights and justice and accountability for all?
Something. It upholds something. Look, when it comes to legal theory, I'm a positivist, and I think that much of what passes under the description of international law is analysis dreamed up by law professors with a different kind of agenda. I think countries that undertake international obligations should meet their obligations. We had this discussion a few moments ago. You'll perhaps recall that. And I think that if there were more attention to holding countries accountable for their commitments in international agreements, we'd all be a lot better off without academic theorizing about international law.
So who holds countries to accountable, as you said, if some of the victims are the weak? Not everyone's a superpower, not everyone's a citizen of a superpower. Who stands up for those
I don't know
people?
who holds anybody accountable. You know, I believe in sovereignty, and I believe in democratic sovereignty, and I don't believe that there's anybody else who can hold the U.S. accountable. I think within the life on this earth that our supreme authority is the Constitution of the United States, and not anything other than or higher than that.
So doesn't that leave then the relationship between countries down to the principle of might is right, that the strong, through their bilateral agreements or ability to negotiate bilateral agreements, get their way over others?
No, I don't think it means that at all. You want to have a half-hour discussion of international law? I'm raring to go, except I think you're going to cut me off here in about 30 seconds. But I think you're really well below the surface of it at this point.
Thank you so much. Well, let me then ask you about if you have any regrets. This is not my feelings. This is, to quote the ACLU, do you have any regrets about threatening the International Court of Justice judges and prosecutors with sanctions, something the ACLU said, quote, the National Security Advisor is trying to intimidate judges and prosecutors by treating them like drug traffickers?
I think the ICC is illegitimate. I've believed that for many years, and I've written about that at great length. Perhaps you'll quote me instead of the ACLU.
Well, you didn't mind quoting the ACLU, sir, when you referred to it in a tweet of June 16th, 2020, saying, please see the ACLU statement on my upcoming book release. Is the ACLU only worth quoting when it defends your book and not when it's defending the rights of what it says are victims of torture in Afghanistan who require accountability?
I think, yeah, you know, this has been interesting, and we've had the half an hour that I promised, and I was glad to do it. I think you quote people who normally disagree with you when they do disagree with you, because I think it proves how strong your own point is.
Thank you very much, John Bolton there.